So I'm going to talk about something called reductionism, which is really a philosophical topic. And so philosophy is not really, but I had a doctorate in philosophy. In fact, everybody who has a PhD has. But I wish any of us took some philosophy. I did actually take a couple of classes. But anyway, I'm going to start this whole discussion with asking you a question. I want to ask you, if I were to ask you, what is reality made of? A profound, deep question. What's reality made of? And then I showed you a picture like that. And it would guide your mind in a certain way. You know, that's a supernova remnant. You were thinking about particles and things like that. I don't know if I kind of change that and say, what is reality made of? And now, what would that change in your view of what reality might convey? What do you see that sort of this suggests?
Beauty?
Beauty, yeah. Beauty. Order, beauty. Yeah. But then if I showed you that and I said, what's reality made of? What would you think?
Relationships.
Relationships. Yeah, so we experience life with a lot of diverse aspects. In reality, that's what we do. And this talk is about the experiencing of life. Really, philosophy is about explaining our experiences. And when philosophy, be careful of philosophy that does away with your experiences, because that can just, that is out of the job. Philosophy is supposed to explain your experiences. That's what it's supposed to do. Somebody said philosophy is the story of how all things, in the widest sense of things, hang together in the widest sense of hang together. Okay, so, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to kind of dabble a little bit in philosophy. So the thing is that our experience, which I was talking to, has many aspects. It's multi-aspectual. For example, if I were to, this is something that's part of reality. I would hope we can agree on that. And so if I were to ask you about what are the aspects that govern this, we may start with, let's say, the most primitive aspect is, the numerical aspect. I can count it if there's one of them right here. Let's say, it's got a spatial aspect. It's here. It's not here. It's got 5 inches long and 2.5 inches wide, or whatever it is. It's got some half inch. On top of that, there are other aspects. It has a kinetic aspect, like if I kind of toss it around, it's moving. It has a physical aspect, Yeah, it's got a particular kind of response to my knuckle, and my knuckle has a response to it. It has other aspects. It has, in a passive way, not active way, but passive way, it has a biotic aspect. I may use this as a health monitor or something. It's helping me, and so I look to it for it can be part of what could be biotic laws. It has a sensory aspect in the sense that, for example, it can passively provide me with sensory information. It can do recordings, it can do various things. It has a logical aspect. It exists. It doesn't both exist and not exist. It is subject to logical laws. And I could go on, and in fact, everything, it has, a historical aspect. This was, some years ago, this was in China, in pieces on the table, and somebody put it together. It has a social aspect. It has Facebook. It has an economic aspect. It costs a lot of money. It's had an aesthetic aspect. Boy, you would have believed Steve Jobs, made sure it had an aesthetic aspect. It has a justicial aspect in some way, passively, perhaps.
You own it.
Yeah, I own it. Thank you. As an ethical aspect, it could be that I could use it for evil. I could detonate a bomb remotely with this. That would be not good. It has a fiduciary aspect in the sense that there was it can obey rules regarding, trust. For example, I could loan it to somebody, and when they don't give it back, this becomes the subject of the fiduciary aspect of life. So it is all these things, aspects of our experience are all operative and acting, and they act on everything. I took a lowly, cell phone, and you know, we can see all of these, and different things max out at something as being active. In other words, they will be like, you know, a human being is maxes out right up here. But like, you know, a proton might max out somewhere here as being active. It is actively, you know, an object, but it's passively, you know, subject of the other aspects. But the point is that we experience life in all these aspects, and these aspects are interconnected. If I were to try to explain one part of its aspects, like its weight, and I didn't use the quantitative aspect that is in reality, that is in the world, or some of the other aspects, I would actually not even be able to say what weight is. So the aspects are interconnected. Now, then there is a plurality of aspects, but it is often, when you actually do your day-to-day life, it becomes useful to actually reduce the aspects and not think about all the aspects at the same time. And that is a mechanism by which we make sense of the world. So this is, for example, in a lot of disciplines, divide and conquer, you know, is a technique. It's basically you just think about one thing at a time, you get that done, or you think about one thing at a time and solve a problem in a simple way and think that mostly you got it right. Basically, there's another thing that happens to be true about our world is often aggregates that are complicated can be reduced, can be understood when we break them into their atoms, where there's some subject, like in economics, you may think of an individual business or an individual person as being the atom. It could function as the atom of the economic system, just like in physics, you know, a particle could be, you know, yeah.
What is an aggregate?
Aggregate is a collection. It's a bunch of things. So yeah. So aggregates, and most things are aggregates, but then you can break it down into pieces. Now, reductionism, which is this reducing to one or fewer aspects, can have two flavors. There's one flavor that it's called methodological reductionism, and it breaks down the description of the aggregate into its simpler components. It's a way of doing business. It's a way of, in fact, doing science. It's probably the way of doing science. There's another one of these, though, which is called ontological reductionism, where you'll find me making, you know, that's where I'm going to pick a bone on this, where we're going to spend some good bit of time on the ontological reduction. That's where you kind of make the leap from this method works of breaking things down and thinking of them as simply being governed only by some laws, not all the laws. But now you make the leap that says, actually, that's all there is. That's all there is. And so we'll see examples of this and what this leads to, and, you know, what are it. But before we go to the ontological, let's just kind of spend a little time with methodological, because if you ask any physicist, they will tell you that this is gloriously successful. And they're right. It is gloriously successful. For example, there were, in the old days, phenomena that, you know, philosophers would look at the sky, and they would see the stars, and they would see the planets, and they followed some rules. And then they had objects falling on their head while they were sitting under the apple tree, and that was other phenomena. Until this basically happened to Newton, although it didn't really happen to Newton. Supposedly all that happened was Newton was sort of away from college because of some economic hardship, and he saw an apple fall down.
Black Plague.
What's that?
The Black Plague hit London, so he was in the farm.
It was in the farm. Okay, thanks. Yeah. And so it made him, you know, suddenly ask the question without letting go of why should they fall straight down? And out of this came a large amount of activity, not just summarized by this one equation by any stretch. Newton created an entire way of thinking about nature, and that thinking required a whole new kind of math, so he invented that too. He really basically inaugurated, you know, modern understanding of physics. But the point is that in this case, you had phenomena that looked one way and phenomena that looked another way. And so it was part of what looked like a very multivarious experience. And he said, no, they're different manifestations. And these parts of them of the same thing, universal law of gravity.
Well, I mean, the apple's going straight down, and the planets are going in circles, and so everyone said that must be very different kinds of motion.
Oh, yeah.
It's Newton that said obeys the same rule.
Same rule. That's right. That's great. When about 3 years before Newton died, this guy was born, Immanuel Kant, and he was in the 18th century. And Kant was so impressed with Newton that he really wanted to basically follow Newton's methodology for everything. And he came up with, for example, he saw in just the simple, universal law of gravitation enough causal content to explain the formation of all the planets. And so that theory that he had of objects in space, dust and gas in space, coming together and under the laws of gravity starting swirling and flattening out and then clumping, and under the force of that gravity basically becoming planets, that's kind of pretty much vaguely about right, about the same thing that people would say now. This was in the 18th century. So there was a lot of power in this unification and in this universal law. And in fact, physicists have made an amazing amount of progress in taking all these multivariate phenomena and constantly, basically looking at unification principles. For example, electricity, everything from lightning to static clinging is electrical phenomena. But it turns out it's very closely, tightly related to what a bar magnet does. And it's closely related to light's behavior. And all of that now has one name. It's brought together under electromagnetism. Then there was this other stuff that had to do with nuclear decay. It turned out that has to do with a force that is called the weak nuclear force. And it turns out that those two can actually be shown to be different, unified together under one electroweak, what's called electroweak interaction. And the theory that postulated that thing should be happening also predicted the existence of particles that then later were seen. Exactly, where it was predicted. And there have been other attempts to unify and by and large to great success, although the part that we may have reached the limit right here between gravity and basically the standard model. That may or may not pan out. But the point is that this business of unifying, simplifying, reducing seems extremely successful, to the point that you fast forward from a few hundred years and you have things like this that you can do using those things, that methodology. So it's been, if anything, it's been incredibly successful. But in all that we're doing, we're making simplifying assumptions. And the point is, it's a simplifying assumption of something that could inherently be much, much more complicated. And in fact, my professor, Joe Dreitlein, who got me into physics, I remember sitting just before an exam. It was I think it was a final. And I felt chatty enough. I said, Professor Dreitlein, I realized that the parabola is wrong. It's really an ellipse. It's actually sort of orbiting. And he goes, you're wrong. He goes, you'll always be wrong. And he says, because physics is an art of approximation. Everything you say is just the next order correction. This was good enough for what we had to say. It's a little grumpy. That's okay.
You're right, it is an ellipse. Because if it was a parabola, it would go out to infinity. So.
Yeah, it's because the vector, the gravity vector, is not really constant. It's like that. But of course, that water bottle will affect that trajectory, so it's an approximation. In fact, physicists love to approximate everything so much and simplify everything. They like to, for example, use points. They constantly think about points, like the whole planet becomes a point or a sphere. And so many problems we did in electromagnetism was like spherical this and spherical that the joke was, imagine a spherical cow. Like that would be the way homework problem would start. So the spherical cow is actually quite a common joke among physicists. All right, so methodological naturalism or methodological reductionism is wildly successful, and no question. But now let's go ahead and talk about the ontological reductionism. And so what is ontology? Well, ontology is basically the subject in philosophy that covers, what is the essence and origin of things? What is things made of? Where do they come from? How are they? And ontological reductionism is any time when you say it's all nothing but, and you fill in the blank. And when you do that, that's all nothing but, you have begun the process of doing reductionism. And it can come in two flavors. There's sort of a weak ontological reduction, where you say at the most primary cause of things is this stuff. And that begets all these other things that you observe. But there's also a strong one, which is kind of exclusive. It says, the primary thing is this one, and by the way, that's all there is. This stuff doesn't even exist. There's other stuff. And we'll see examples of that. But perhaps the most prominent example in our time is sort of the materialist picture. Sometimes it's also known as the naturalist picture. In the materialist picture, the world is entirely determined by material causes. The particles, interactions between them, and everything that is real then can be traced on this view, to particles of forces, including our minds, our consciousness. And so that your consciousness now, the claim goes, is really particles interacting with particles. And one famous example of this is Will Provine here. If I can get this thing going.
It's going.
Yeah. Oh, Jerry.
There it's going. Good.
Evolutionary perspective. They're here today and they're gone tomorrow, and that's all there is to it.
Dr. Will Provine, professor of the history of biology at Cornell University, gave us another disturbing glimpse into where Darwinism can lead.
Oh, I was a Christian, but I never heard anything about evolution because it was illegal to teach it in Tennessee.
Dr. Provine's first biology professor changed all that.
He started talking about evolution as if they had no design in it whatsoever. And I came up to him and I said, "You left out the most important part." And he said, "If you feel the same way at the end of one quarter, I want you to stand up in front of the students in this class and tell them this deep black and evolution." And I read that book so carefully, I could find no sign of there being any design whatsoever in evolution. And I immediately began to doubt the existence of a deity. But it starts by giving up an active deity. Then it gives up the hope that there's any life after death. When you give those two up, the rest of it follows fairly easily. You give up the hope that there's an imminent morality. And finally, there's no human free will. If you believe in evolution, you can't hope for there being any free will. There's no hope whatsoever of there being any deep meaning in human life. We live, we die, and we're gone. We're absolutely gone when we die.
Okay. So he said there is no free will. And what's he saying? What does he mean by that?
He didn't have any choice in what he just said. He couldn't help it.
Yeah, that's right. You're almost upstaging my car. Yeah. So basically, he's saying that if it's all particles and if it's evolution, now underneath the Darwinian mechanism is materialism. It's all particles, and if it's that, then it's all deterministic as well, or at least it's not subject to anything other than processes that are natural processes that are either random or they're deterministic, and therefore there can be no free will. That in fact leads to this strong form of ontological reductionism as applied to psychology or to thinking in what is called eliminative materialism. Traditional materialism would say the material conditions determine the mental realm. In other words, what you think, you're thinking. It's like this. Your opinion depends on what you ate for lunch. You had pizza for dinner, just like I did, and that's why you're going to give a talk on reductionism. But eliminative materialism says the mental realm doesn't even exist. It claims that all of our thoughts, convictions, desires, intentions, perceptions, and decisions are fictions. In fact, here's a quote. Our starting assumption as scientists ought to be that on some level, consciousness itself has to be an illusion. Let that sink in for a minute. Illusion belongs to what realm? Consciousness. You can't have an illusion if you're not conscious. The reason is obvious. If nothing in the physical world can have the features that consciousness seems to have, what's he talking about here? He's talking about particles. If particles don't have consciousness, then it's obvious that consciousness cannot exist as a thing in the physical world. Now this is a little weird, right? Because he's making this statement as a conscious being. So it reminds me of, well, before I tell you what it reminds me of, here's another philosopher's opinion of this. He said the denial of consciousness is surely the strangest thing that has ever happened to the whole history of human thought. It shows that the power of human credulity is unlimited, that the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith, is truly unbounded. It reveals the deepest irrationality of the human mind. So I guess he's not impressed. To me, it reminds me of a favorite Charlie Brown cartoon. Here, they're walking, this is brother and sister, Lucy's telling Linus, hey, well, look, a big yellow butterfly. It's unusual to see one this time of year, unless, of course, he flew up from Brazil. I bet that's it. They do that sometimes, They fly up from Brazil and they, oh, this is no butterfly, it's a potato chip. Well, I'll be, so it is. I wonder how a potato chip got it all the way there from Brazil. There's a time you have to give up your premise. You have to recognize when, you've kind of left the train. But materialism that is not the only kind of reductionism. Interestingly, when in the modern times in the 17th, 18th century, where, Newton and all these Enlightenment philosophers and scientists were part of them, they basically, they were advocating science, reason, facts, objectivity, and these things. And they just poo-pooed the arts and the social aspects of life. And against these people came a group that said, no, you lie. The mind is all there is. In fact, matter doesn't exist. Mind is all there is. How do I know the truth? How do I know you exist? You're a useful fiction. It's like, I like thinking that you exist, therefore you're there. As far as I know, all I know is what my brain is. And that the idealist says, I think, therefore I am, and that's all I really know, and everything else is a useful fiction. It's amazing that very famous physicists are in the camp of this philosophy too, which is really weird because they should not be in this business. But like Mach was, a follower of this philosophy. So the mind is all there is was the other way, pendulum swing the other way, the other kind of reductionism, which now disavowed the material world and said that the mental world is all there is. And that this was known as the Romantic or the Idealist movement, and it gave, over the course of the centuries, it gave birth to current postmodernism. Modern is not the same as postmodern. So what is postmodernism? It basically says that that truth doesn't really exist. It's a social construction, and basically every community has its own view of truth, and it can't be judged by anyone else outside that community. And when you try to make
of course, that statement is true.
Exactly.
Even if you don't belong in that community.
That is exactly the point. Yeah, that's thank you. Yeah, you're just pounding the table saying truth doesn't exist. Even science is not exempt, and in fact, you will find postmodern advocates, philosophers or academics talking about, pardon me, like math being a form of rape because you are forcing your truth on somebody else. 2 + 2 = 4. And so this postmodernism can go really wacky. And science itself is essentially also, is social construction. So there's no such real thing. It works, it's true for you if you kind of hear, in fact, you do you is sort of a postmodern thing to say. Any claim to have objective truth then is seen as nothing but an attempt by one interpretive community ramming down its values on another interpretive community. And so therefore you can't make a claim to any absolute truth, anything that's true for everybody. That's postmodernism. So now we have sort of the modernist objectivism, postmodern is extreme subjectivism, and we have to remember that in a sense, neither one of them is really, like from a Christian point of view, neither of them are Christian. But in fact, both of them have aspects of Christianity in them. Now, here's how it works. Materialism makes the mistake of reducing humans to the product of physical forces, saying there's nothing else. Whereas postmodernism reduces them to social forces and says there's no absolute truth. But in a Christian picture, the Bible will say that there is an absolute truth, whether you like it or not. But also you are fallible. Your reasoning is fallible. Because these guys who says that it's subject to social forces, they would say you can't make your truth claim and pound me with it because that's just something you got out of your community. The Bible would say there is an absolute truth, but be careful because you could get it wrong. All right, so we have these reductionisms, and so there are these competing claims to how things are. And in fact, Rob here kind of gave a hint as to what you can do about it. Sometimes a truth claim is made, and it's difficult to adjudicate. It's difficult to know whether that truth claim can be true or not. Somebody's making it, I did see the UFO last night. Well, I wasn't there, so I guess I'm going to have to, argue with you about that, or no, I don't know what to say. Sometimes, though, a philosophy will do you a favor by being self-destructive. And so then I don't have to worry about it. So when does it do that? And so how can you evaluate? You can't always do this, but you can always apply this test. And philosophers call this a coherence test. Coherence is a minimum criterion that any theory needs to have. And a theory would be incoherent if it has a flaw that causes it to negate itself.
But it's just because your community likes coherence. I don't even have a definition of it.
Postmodernist, I can see that. So other terms that people sometimes use is self-defeating or absurdity. So let me show you examples of incoherence. There is one they call the self-referential incoherence. A self-referentially incoherent belief is one that makes a claim that undercuts itself. For example, if you say, I'm lying, well, your belief that you're lying undercuts the fact that you're lying. You've just shot your own argument. There are strong and weak versions of this type of incoherence. In the strong case, this statement cancels its own truth. Like the Taoist example is, nothing can be said of the Tao. Well, you just said something about the Tao. In the weak case, though, it just casts doubts on itself. Like a Freudian example is, every belief is a product of the believer's unconscious emotional needs. Okay, well then in that case, the fact that you, Mr. Freud, said that, maybe it's your unconscious emotional needs that, anyway. All right, then there could be incoherence in assumptions. So a theory is incoherent if it's incompatible with something you have to assume for the theory to be true. For example, this is a materialist example. Only physical things are real. Now think about the assumptions you have to make to accept, to even perceive that sentence. Mm-hmm. It is a linguistic sentence, so it has linguistic value. It is logical, it makes a logical assertion. Neither one of these is physical. an electron doesn't follow logic in the sense that the electron is not aware of logic. Its behavior you can apply logic to, but you can't get logic just out of it. The electron itself can't argue logically. Neither of these aspects is physical. So you're making an assumption and you're not able to follow it. This one is my favorite. Question authority. Sometimes you'll see that on the bathroom wall, and you say, and somebody else will write, is that in order? So
I bet you wrote that.
I just enjoyed reading it. So here's some examples of Marxist reductionism. Karl Marx says the truth claims are nothing but rationalizations of economic interest. Laws are created by the rich people to protect their pure property. Religion is the opiate of the people, placating the poor with false promises of a happy afterlife. But when he makes a grand statement like that all truth claims are like that, well, you can ask the question, what about your own truth claim? Is that not, then you, according to you, it's motivated by your economic interests. Nietzsche, all human action is driven by the will to power. Morality is invented by the weak to give them leverage against the strong. Religion is a holy lie used to control people. But again, if all human action is driven by a will to power, well, Mr. Nietzsche, should we assume that your own theory is driven by a will to power? Or would you make an exception in just your own case? Freudian reductionism. Sigmund Freud would say all thoughts are shaped by unconscious emotional needs. We kind of covered that. Personality is shaped by things like early toilet training. Much of human behavior is a result of sexual repression. Well, Mr. Freud, so what unconscious emotional needs of yours shape your views? This one probably is actually very... B.F. Skinner, humans are nothing but stimulus response mechanisms to responding to rewards and punishments like these pigeons used to do experiments with. Their behavior is explainable in terms of operating conditions like pigeons pecking at levers to get a pellet of food. But if all humans are stimulus response mechanisms, I wonder what stimuli causes him to have the response, which is his theory. Because that undercuts it. Now, notice that we're always doing the same thing. We're kind of shooting everything down with its own. How is it that you can do it? You can almost turn it into a theorem. A reductionist worldview is going to be self-refuting almost always, because almost always it ends up, and I say almost because I might have not seen them all, but everyone I've seen reduces reason to something less. It says the ideas in our minds are the products of something or another, electrochemical responses in the brain, economic conditions, emotional needs, whatever you'd like to put in there. And when it does that, that has the problem that the only way that worldview could even be stated is using human reason. So by discrediting reason, it undercuts its own case. And so then it becomes very simple. So all this thing about reason and how do you know is a subject, we use the fancy philosophy word ontology. Now the other big fancy philosophy word is, what's that word? Epistemology, which is from Greek episteme, which means to know. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit, because we are making epistemic statements. Yeah, we're talking about how do you know something. And basically, epistemology deals with how do you know something is true. And so, you can have beliefs, and then there can be things that are true, and the two could overlap. Some of your beliefs are actually true, but they might be true for the wrong reason, or they could be true for a justified reason. For example, every time my cat meows a lot at night, it's raining in the morning, and tonight the cat, is kind of, making a lot of noise. Tomorrow morning, I'm sure it's going to be raining. And it turns out that belief of yours that it was going to be raining was justified because tomorrow it's raining and the ground is wet. But it wasn't a very justified belief. It's true belief. It was justified true belief. So that's sort of what knowledge is, and knowledge is justified true belief. So then the question is, how does a Christian view of the world give you a better basis for knowledge? And the basic thing that one has to remember is that if your worldview has as the self-existent source of everything else something inside the world, it is necessarily reducing things. Whereas in a Christian point of view, from a Christian worldview, it is not a reductionist point of view. The divine is outside of creation, all that exists, and that is whether visible or invisible. So logic, math, beauty, love, anything that you can think of is all contingent on God. God created it, and he's not subject to those laws. He created those laws. And he's also omniscient, and he's all-powerful. And that system does not suffer. Even if it was not true, at least it is not suffering from incoherence. Let's put it that way. But it's true. God said, now in Genesis, God continuously saying, and God said, and things happen. God is bringing things out of nothing into existence. In the beginning was the Word, in the book of John. There's another book in the Bible, Colossians, where God, Jesus Christ is said to be, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and he is essentially all things were created by him and through him. So that in a Christian view of the world, the source of everything is not something in this universe. It is outside this universe with the capacity to create all those aspects with all their laws and endow us with the mind to be able to understand it. And that's the last part, and that's where it touches on epistemology. A creator like that can also give us minds that can understand. So the intelligible order of the universe reflects the mind of the creator. And because God created us in his image, our minds correspond to that order as well. Now, if you might have seen this quote by Einstein. It says, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And this is a reasonable statement from a materialist point of view. Why should I, the product of Darwinian processes, be able to do general relativity? Why?
Igner said the, how do we call it, the unusual something ability of mathematics.
Oh, yeah.
He had the same kind of comment.
Oh,
Why does
unreasonable effectiveness?
Yeah,
Yeah.
mathematics. Why does math work for describing the world?
Yeah. And I think I've heard Paul Davies, eloquently talk, in the video, talk about that. So this is exactly where you would end up. It's a very incomprehensible thing. Why should I be able to comprehend it? I was talking about how physics is the art of approximations. And you'll always be wrong. But that doesn't change the marvel of it. How is it that a universe that is so intricate that I can almost never plumb its depths still allows me to engineer it, subdue the earth, and be essentially in charge of the universe, or not the universe, but my environment. So that should be interesting. That should be amazing. A Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga says he has this Latin phrase "adiactio." I don't think I'm saying it right. Could you help me with that? Intellectus ad rem. But it said the intellect is adequate to reality. God created both us and our world in such a way as to that there's a certain fit and match between the world and our cognitive, faculties. This is really important because in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, God commands Adam and Eve to go forth, multiply, and subdue the earth. To subdue the earth, you have to be able to understand the earth, to be able to understand, and that means, essentially you have to be able to do science and engineering to subdue the earth. We have essentially subdued the earth in some sense, right? We can go anywhere in it, until of course a major, hurricane occurs, we realize still where we are compared to the earth. But generally, we have been given faculties where we can make these approximations. Why is it, you could ask, that the laws of physics, imagine gravity. Gravity, I wrote a simple equation. That equation is actually not the true, perfect answer to what gravity is. Einstein figured out that it had to do with an interaction of matter with what he calls, space-time. Matter bends space-time, and the space-time that is bent causes matter to move. And that interaction describes much better everything that's going on than that simple equation. But from that simple equation, Kant was able to describe planetary formation. We were able to figure out all the orbits of the planets. We could do a ton of things. We could do it without being super sophisticated all at once. So that's kind of neat. So up to here, we're talking about how philosophically and logically there are problems with reductionism. But now we come to a different aspect of it, and that's the dignity of man. The Christian view of dignity of man starts from the fact that God created man in Genesis, it says, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. This is from Michelangelo. This hand is hand of God touching the hand of man that's made in his image. And the dignity of man is founded on the fact that we were made in God's image. And that becomes a very important principle. And when atheists look at that, like Richard Rorty, he says, he frankly says evolution can't be the source of human rights, where the weak are left behind. So if I, as a race or something, am physically stronger than, let's say, your race or your race, then so what? Yeah, that's right. That's the way it goes. And maybe if I should just destroy everybody who's a weaker race, that's fine. You know, there is nothing. All of those things that makes us recoil at that kind of thought, at the ugliness of that thought, is coming from the fact that we were made in God's image. We recoil at it naturally, as we should, because, and it's because we're underneath knowing that we were created. He says the universal human rights is a concept that is derived from religious claim that beings are made in the image of, human beings are made in the image of God. This Jewish and Christian element in our tradition is gratefully invoked by freeloading atheists like myself. So he said, I'm a freeloader, I'm going to go ahead and grab your morality because it's very useful, even though I realize that it might be a system of thought. I have no way to justify it. And in a way, you know, I think that, you know, when people, I mean, a lot of atheists would say, you know, things like Provine said, but in the next breath, you know, they will decry, you know, your sexism or, you know, your homophobia or whatever they're going to attack you on. And whatever basis they are having for that treatment is negated by their materialist belief. If it's materialism, what do you care? It's just some molecules. So when you do reductionism, you generally denigrate man. The Christian understanding is we're made in God's image. Doing with God, we replace him with an aspect in the world. We inevitably reduce man or humankind to something less. And when we reduce people to anything less than fully human, then we treat them as less than fully human. And so and here is obviously you know, where one's mind can go on this. You know, Nazism was organized around a reduction to race. So race determined a lot of things about you, and there were better races and there were worse races, and why not get rid of the worst races? And so we all know where that led. There was a really sad story that came out when I first wrote this talk in 2015. And this guy was being tried at, I think it was Germany, and he was. So I'm going to just try to read it. Actually, can you read it, Beth?
On the opening day of his trial on 300,000 counts of accessory to murder, the man known as the Accountant of Auschwitz told of the moment he lost his euphoria for Adolf Hitler. He was standing on a train platform after Hungarian Jews had been unloaded at the Nazi death camp. The unwitting condemned had already been sent to the gas chambers. The newly arrived slave laborers had been sent in a different direction. Left behind on the platform was a crying infant. As the child cried, one of the now 93-year-old Oscar Groning's fellow SS officers approached it, grabbed it by the leg, dashed its head against a nearby truck, and then tossed the lifeless body into the truck. As horrific as that story is, what might have been more shocking was Groning's next observation. I don't know what else I could have expected the guard to do with the baby, he mused. I suppose he could have shot it, though.
So this is, you know, where, you know, he's down in his heart, he still hasn't understood the dignity of man. In America, now I'm part of you because I was in your army before, but now I say we. We talk about unalienable rights, right? The Declaration of Independence, the second sentence, says those words. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit, and happiness." Now, there was a really cool documentary that starts with, just who is this supposed to be self-evident to? And because much of human history, humankind denies these things, that there are these unalienable rights. These were the products of a biblical worldview working its way in Europe, which was completely pagan 2,000 years ago, and gradually changing that. And these guys were, thinking. So we can say that Christianity sees the world in all its colors. Materialism. We talked about materialism. Christianity would say, God did create a material universe. He produced it very good, in fact. And within its limitations, materialism can tell us a great deal about, the physical universe. So we would agree with the materialist that there's a lot you can do there. What about rationalism? God did create the world in which, it has a rationally knowable structure. He also created the human mind with a corresponding structure, that thing that we were just talking about. Empiricism. Now, we didn't talk about empiricism. It's another kind of reductionism, where you say essentially only that which I can basically sense is right. So God did create the world with a sensory dimension, and He equipped humans with the 5 senses to function in this world. How about romanticism and postmodernism? Yeah, it was right to oppose the Enlightenment worldview that reduces humans to complex mechanism, and it was right to assert human freedom and creativity, of course, but then where it says the material world doesn't exist, it's not right. So, in summary then, Christianity gives us a worldview that is big enough to see the whole tapestry of reality and the whole tapestry of the human existence. Reductionisms, we isolate one strand. Christianity is thoroughly non-reductionist and holds all of that together.